Coming live from Washington, D.C., USA is our guest tonight. Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have John Sitilides, Principal of Trilogy Advisors in Washington. He's geopolitical strategist and diplomacy consultant to the U.S. State Department. Welcome to the show, John.
It's a pleasure to be with you and your audience today, Ajay. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to the show. Welcome to India. And since this is a global show, it's going on to a lot of places. And in future, I'm sure a lot of people will be able to make sense of what's happening in the global world. And that is where you are a master for today. You will be able to help us understand, to make sense of a lot of nonsense that's happening, some sense. Maybe we can, it will be all helpful from you. Now, my first question, the topic is Washington and the world, the new geopolitics of great power rivalry. But my first question is, John, let me start it this way. Recently, there was this whole stuff about the Doomsday Clock. And it says the clock now stands 90 seconds to midnight. The closest to global catastrophe it has ever been. And one of the major reasons was Ukraine. Now, if we are so close to disaster, so close to catastrophe, in 2012, they were talking about, the Mayan calendar that the world will end. But this is now the real calendar, which shows that we are very close to catastrophe. So what do you see, John, when is the world ending?
Yeah, it's a very good question that you asked, because it also takes on the role of media in influencing public opinion around the world. Let's just get down to the basics. First of all, this is a non-governmental organization. Its own advisors have their subjective opinions, and there is absolutely nothing authoritative about the Doomsday Clock in any way that will seriously influence the decisions and actions of political leaders in Washington, in Beijing, in New Delhi, in Moscow, really anywhere in the world. But it's interesting because it galvanizes the public's attention on the kinds of dangers that are attendant with what is happening with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and especially Vladimir Putin's willingness to entertain the idea of using tactical nuclear weapons in order to achieve his objectives on the battlefield. Now, it's also a very ahistorical stunt, for lack of a better word, Ajay, because if we look back at the history of the world over the last 50, 60, 70 years since the end of the Cold War, there have been a number of incidents in global affairs that have brought the world closer to a possible nuclear showdown. We had the consideration by the Eisenhower administration to deal with the first Taiwan crisis with the People's Republic of China, and with the invasion of South Korea by North Korea, with the possible pushback using nuclear weapons. We, of course, had the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. We had the Yom Kippur War in the early 1970s, when the U.S. was ready to reposition nuclear forces to DEFCON 3, given the Soviet Union's involvement in the Yom Kippur War. And of course, in the early 1980s, as a response to the Soviet Union's deployment of nuclear missiles in Europe, when the U.S. responded, we almost had the dissolution of the NATO alliance, which could have certainly led to a much more dangerous situation on the European continent during the height of the Cold War. So we've been through many crises on the world stage in the past, and I don't believe the Russian invasion of Ukraine quite matches the temperament and the intensity of those previous crises. But what is useful here is to keep in mind that really for the first time in 30 years, since the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we do, from a strategic perspective, have to seriously consider the possible, hopefully negligible consideration of, but the possible use of nuclear weapons in a kinetic conflict. So we essentially sleepwalked through the last 3 decades, and now sort of the ruthless reality of great power rivalry is back on the world stage. And whether it's Russia, whether it's a possible showdown in the Pacific over Taiwan, or other aggressive or belligerent activities by the People's Republic of China in the Indo-Pacific region, there is now the backdrop, the very real backdrop of the possible use of nuclear weapons in order to attain political objectives on the ground.
Right, right. Now, thank you for helping us understand. But as somebody who covers a lot of, talks about a lot of business and also tries to understand politics that, defines a lot of business, help us understand whether we should, as an individual, should plan for, say, next 10 years, 15
Hmm.
years, the way the world is standing today. Because they say, your young generation says, you only live once, YOLO. So why not live today? Because you do not know about the world tomorrow. How does it look from where you are sitting, John? Because you know a lot about from Capitol Hill to all the hills possible. Tell us, is peace such an uphill task?
Uh, from a very human perspective, Ajay, I would say that we don't know what's going to be happening anywhere in the world tomorrow, next week, next month, let alone 1, 3, 5, 10 years out. However, we do have a responsibility to plan ahead as best as we possibly can, whether it's in our individual lives, our business careers, or obviously in terms of foreign affairs and international relations. So I don't want to give any of your audience members the misimpression that I'm forecasting. I'm not a forecaster, nor do I pretend to be one, but we do take a very close look at recent trends and developments and directions and try to better understand why leaders around the world make the decisions that they do. It's actually part of the work that I conduct for the State Department's Foreign Service Institute, which is the State Department's diplomatic academy, where we train American foreign policy professionals. And again, to the point, we don't try to predict what's going to be happening in X number of years looking forward, but try to understand why political leaders make the decisions that they do and what is inherent in the political culture of, say, a country such as India or China or Germany or Bolivia, for that matter, and try to understand what factors shape the decisions that leaders will make, and then try to anticipate events and developments in order to better understand, anticipate, and mitigate risk on the geopolitical front. So what we're looking at here, if we just talk first about sort of U.S.-China relations, is we have clearly been in a period of great power rivalry, possibly for the better part of the last 10 years. And even though much of this seems to have been ginned up since 2017, 2018, I would posit, Ajay, that it's really with the ascendance of General Secretary Xi Jinping, his rise to power in Beijing in 2012, where China, however much it was already developing a very growing and powerful military, a much more technologically advanced economy, and had longer-term designs to reassert its economic primacy and potential military primacy on the Asian continent, that it really was still abiding by Deng Xiaoping's axiom to bide one's time and hide one's strength. And so the phrasing we always heard with the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party was their peaceful rise. And since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, he's pretty much abandoned that sort of global diplomacy strategy and taken on a far more aggressive, a far more belligerent approach, beginning with the dredging and reclaiming of geological and topographical features in the South China Sea to essentially declare one of the world's most important waterways a Chinese lake at the expense of the economic rights and sovereign rights of almost all of China's Southeast Asian neighbors. We see it with the Belt Road Initiative, which is in many ways a debt diplomacy, predatory lending of smaller, poorer countries around the world. And we've seen it in open speeches by Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders. They make no secret about their ambitions to unify Taiwan, hopefully peacefully, but if necessary by force, and for China to have a quote unquote world-class military power projection capability by 2049, which is the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's coming to power in Beijing. And look, I presume much of your audience is also based in India. Look at the tensions that have been escalating at Beijing's initiative against India, which seeks a peaceful coexistence with China and with its neighbors on the Asian continent. And yet it was the Chinese forces that attacked the Indian forces in the Himalaya mountains several years ago. And now we see an escalation of tension, unwelcome and unnecessary, except that Beijing is looking to push into Indian sovereign territory to claim territory that belongs rightfully to India. And so we see all of these manifestations of a much more aggressive Chinese foreign policy, and we haven't even begun to go into trade and technology and a whole host of other areas where China is looking to literally upend the global international trading system and have everyone be able to operate on that trade system in the 21st century on China's terms.
Right, right, John. Now you explore the complex geopolitical and geo-economic decisions that impact markets in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East and worldwide. So when we are talking of politics, business cannot be away from it. Economics cannot be away from it. You also talked about the responsibilities that individuals have. Perhaps we must talk also about the responsibilities that world leaders who are shaping our destinies have at the moment. So, firstly, John, is it about political control, political power, or is it about economics that's happening in global politics? How is this working out? Second thing is that if we see the present situation down there in Europe, China seemed to be talking about peace. I just heard, one of your talks in one of the television channels, and there it was China which were talking about as a peacekeeper, and the U.S. you said has a tremendous deficit in U.S. Strategic thinking. That was what you said there. And then there is another situation panning out is that, which I don't know whether it will happen or not, but about Chinese supplying drones to the Russians. And if that happens, how this particular leads to where? So putting all these things together, John, as an individual sitting down, so many kilometers away from Europe, who have nothing to do with Europe, technically, I get scared that that it may come down to a difficult situation for businesses, economics, as well as simple individuals all across the world. And that is where we talk, what about the people who have the responsibility to take care of not only humans in their own country but also humanity as a whole? How do you look at that?
There's a lot to unpack there, Ajay. I think I counted about 4
Right.
questions or subjects to tackle. Let me try to be as concise as I can through the series of answers here. First of all, I would say I'm very mindful of national leaders' responsibility, first and foremost, to their own citizenry. I'm somewhat skeptical about sort of devotions to the well-being of humanity and paeans to one world government and the like. The Prime Minister Modi is responsible first and foremost for the well-being of the Indian people. President Biden is primarily responsible for the well-being of the American people. Every national leader, whether that country is a beneficial country or a malign actor on the world stage, has a national leadership that is going to look at for that country's best interest, the interests of the people, the interests of the economy, the interests of the society, and of course, their own survival and maintenance of power. So I don't want to go into this concept of what is best for humanity. That's more of a philosophical discussion. And I think when we're talking about the raw nature of geopolitics and competition, let's focus on how national leaders look to advance their own country's national interests. On the China issue that you raised with the peace plan, I'm going backwards here, I think, on your questions, Ajay. I don't know to what extent there is something substantive or something genuine that the parties can work with, but there may be components of a Chinese peace plan or a peace plan by any other major power that could help to bring about an end to the conflict. And I think one of the things that we're looking here from a debate perspective is, to what extent is China benefiting from this war right? I mean, the war is attriting Russia's military. It is causing, I think, a crisis in terms of relations between the G7 countries and countries around the world, such as India, that have decided to not participate in the sanctions against Russia. And that's caused some diplomatic divide. And I would also posit, Ajay, that there is more tension inside of Europe than most analysts care to admit. That there really is a divide between Eastern European countries that directly border or are very close to the Russian border, especially the Baltics and Poland and maybe even Romania, and other countries in Central and probably more Western Europe that are somewhat more sanguine about a supposed Russian threat to NATO. They are looking to see how they're able to work together under American leadership of the NATO alliance to deal with this war in Ukraine that many countries around the world see as largely an intra-European, or maybe even on a more granular level, an intra-Slavic war between Russian and Ukrainian brothers in the Slavic family of nations. So I don't know that we're going to have any type of a cohesive, cogent position by quote unquote Europe, whatever Europe is besides a geological feature of the Eurasian continent, because there are member states of NATO and the European Union that have very different takes on how to deal with Russia, both in terms of this particular crisis right now with the war, and also long term, because Russia's not going anywhere. Russia will remain to the east of Europe, and it will be a nuclear superpower and a commodity superpower for decades to come. And so Europe has to figure out how it's going to coexist with a possibly malign Russian power to its east for the foreseeable future. And then going back to the first part of your sort of multifaceted question, Ajay, in terms of economic power, I think realistically, in the history of mankind, there hasn't really been a great military power that hasn't been predicated on great economic power. They go hand in hand. And in fact, one of the easy criticisms of Russia leading into the Ukraine invasion, and even over the past year, where there's been an active kinetic conflict on Ukrainian territory, is this sort of dismissal of Russia, I think, as the late Senator John McCain put it, as a gas station with nuclear weapons. And with all due respect to the late Senator McCain, I think that's an inaccurate description, because Russia is not only a nuclear superpower, it is a military hardware superpower that is producing artillery shells right now 24/7, right? Vladimir Putin has put the Russian economy on a wartime footing, while Ukraine's military infrastructure has been completely devastated by Russian attacks over the last year. And NATO, frankly, is quite slow in arming Ukraine to be able to effectively defend itself. And the question becomes, how much longer can Ukraine defend itself against what we have been expecting to be a major Russian offensive in the weeks ahead? It's a commodity superpower, and now it will continue to export oil and coal and natural gas and timber and diamonds and foodstuffs and fertilizers and critical metals and rare earth minerals to markets around the world. And so Russia's military might is predicated on significant economic might, even if it's short of what it could be or compared to what the Soviet Union was as an economic power in the 1970s and 1980s. So, yes, there are many jokes about this huge country that has an economy the size of Italy's, but it is an important economy. And I think you look at the rise of China, China's military prowess is predicated on its tremendous economic growth. It's astonishing, almost meteoric GDP increases over the last 30 to 35 years. And even as one looks at the United States, which became an economic colossus in the 19th century and then became a military superpower with World War I and World War II. And coming back to India, we'll close here, with India now having surpassed the United Kingdom as the world's, I think, fifth largest economy, yes, but also with 1.4 billion citizens. In about 15 to 20 years, according to current demographic trends, 1 out of every 5 workers on planet Earth will be in India by 2040. Now, India has many reforms that it needs to undergo, and that's a whole different discussion. But India's military power on the Asian continent, and especially in safeguarding the very important shipping waterways of the maritime superhighway in the Indian Ocean, connecting the South China Sea and the East Asian economic powers there with the Middle East, with the African continent, and with European markets is going to be critical to global security and prosperity in the years ahead. And that's why the United States increasingly values India as a very important partner in the Indo-Pacific and increasingly on the global stage.
Right, right, John. So let's look at the powers then, in terms of country, in terms of individuals. Let's look at the US and Biden. Russia, Mr. Putin. China, you got the Chinese leadership. India is the power to watch out. Amidst all these things, India knows what it wants. We are a very peaceful country. We have never gone out of our shores to create our own interests anywhere beyond spreading love and all. That's what we understand, that I can tell you. But in this present scenario, what does US want? What does Mr. Putin want? What does the Chinese leadership want? Is it about, again I asked, is it about economic power? Because when you talked about 2049, there is also a movie called 2049, and it is a dystopian scenario that is there. If we start looking back, working backwards from there, from the dystopian scenario, maybe not in that sense, but in a very crude sense that the world might not be in a very good shape when we actually come to 49, is that how do we move forward? What is a forward in a better manner? But let's look at the practical part of it. What do all these powers actually they want? And is Ukraine the only hotspot, or are there any other hotspots that you are concerned about and that will lead to much more engaging positively or negatively of these powers that are at the present? How do you look at it?
So, Ajay, let's talk a little bit about the first part of your question in terms of how leaders in the major powers see the situation today and in the future. I would posit that, and this is not about President Biden. This is about sort of the American national security establishment, for lack of a better phrase. And at the risk of oversimplifying, I would say that probably the larger strategic interest is in preserving, upholding, and strengthening the global trade system that the U.S. essentially created with the end of World War II and has protected, along with our regional partners and allies around the world, for the primary reason back in the late 1940s of preventing another catastrophic world war, as the world experienced twice in 40 years. And so to that extent, it's been successful, right? Since 1945, there has not only not been any world war, but there really hasn't been any danger of sliding into a world war, except with what's been happening now in Ukraine, with the possibility of the detonation of a tactical nuclear weapon, which would cross a threshold that I think would be a major shock to the international system. But I would say in many ways that the U.S. is looking to preserve this international trade system that obviously has been incredibly beneficial to the United States and to our allies around the world. But more importantly, it's been beneficial to every country around the world that has sought to expand the prosperity and security and well-being of the nation and its people through a free and open trading system. And it's been a tremendous burden on the American taxpayer. We are paying now, I think it's in the order of $800 to $850 billion that will be proposed by President Biden this week for the American defense budget. And much of that goes to protecting the international trade system around the world, again, in conjunction with our allies and partners. And it's ironic, of course, that the country that has probably benefited the most after the United States, especially since coming into the World Trade Organization in 2001, the communist-led People's Republic of China, is now the country that is most actively seeking to upend that international trade system and replace it with one that is friendly to the Communist Party's interests, as opposed to the one that has benefited the world's economy over the last 80 years more than any other in human history. So I think what you're looking at now is in contrast to America's interest in upholding this international framework for trade, for economic prosperity, and for general security for the peoples around the world. China, and now in many ways joined by what unfortunately seems to be its junior partner in many respects, Russia, is looking to replace that system with one that is friendlier to China's interests and to Russia's interests. And of course, Vladimir Putin traveled to Beijing in February of 2022 at the Beijing Olympics, and that's where China and Russia announced a strategic partnership with zero limits, with no limits. They will cooperate and coordinate their actions across the entire spectrum of diplomatic, economic, and security concerns to look to advance either their mutual interests or their respective interests on the global stage. And we see that playing out not only in Ukraine, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in order to neutralize that country and prevent it from becoming a member of NATO and to determining its own future, but to your other question about hotspots, I would say that's the major hotspot today, because that's where we have the first major armored war in Europe since World War II. But I think that Taiwan and the potential explosive nature of a conflict between the People's Republic of China and the United States, and thereby drawing in other East Asian economies over Taiwan, has the potential to put the world into an economic recession with global catastrophic consequences for India and for the peoples everywhere around the world, especially as shipping lanes in and out of East Asia would be utterly disrupted by any conflict there, let alone the catastrophic human casualty count in terms of dead, injured, the destruction of Taiwan's semiconductor industry, the major disruption to China's global value chains, the removal of or the suspension of China's and Taiwan's and Japan's and South Korea's economies from the global economy for the most intensive period of conflict over Taiwan. And unfortunately, the reason that Taiwan is a potential hotspot and the greatest one in the world today, I would say, is because of open Chinese declarations to potentially forcibly unify Taiwan, to absorb Taiwan into the Communist Party's framework of governance, as we saw not only in prior decades with Tibet and with Xinjiang, but only several years ago with Hong Kong, and now looking into the future, potentially Taiwan. And the Taiwanese people have seen what's happened to Hong Kong, and most of them want no part of it. There is a sizable minority in Taiwan that is looking, in support of the Kuomintang party to potentially reunify with China, but their future would be a bleak one. They would basically become like Hong Kongers. And I think most Taiwanese now that have had a taste of free market, democratic governance want no part of that Communist Party governance on their island. And I would just add one more thing in terms of potential hotspots, Ajay. We're watching very closely right now what is happening with Iran. The fact that it's been disclosed in recent weeks that Iran has reached a level of uranium enrichment in the mid 80%, potentially crossing the threshold of 90% in the weeks or months ahead. That would allow it to be able to build nuclear weapons that it could either deploy on short-range missiles or potentially look to ship via other means to a country such as Israel, which the Iranian leadership has openly called for the extermination of, the annihilation of, for decades. And now that we have the return of Benjamin Netanyahu as Israeli prime minister, this is a man who I believe is absolutely determined to prevent Iran from ever developing the capability to cause great physical damage to Israel. And so going back to our earlier point about national leaders protecting their national interests and their country's well-being, you may see very serious increase in tensions in the Middle East because of these very malign Iranian intentions, not only against Israel, but also against its Sunni Arab neighbors in the Middle East and throughout Northern Africa.
Very, very, will be concerned about. Now, let's look at, can economics can also be the global hotspot? Now, let's look at this scenario here in terms of the structural disengagement of the US and Chinese economies. Now, a lot of this emphasis is there, rerouting of global supply chains away from China to Southeast Asia, India, Latin America, and Africa. How this is going to impact the US relations, because China knows who is doing it, how is it doing it. And it's going to also impact the relations of the Chinese with the places that is taking away that power that they hold, either for political arbitrage or economics as such. How do you see the Chinese reacting to this when they lose out on such a big amount of business to other countries, even neighbors like India, and
Mhm.
also in terms of the leverage that it has with vis-a-vis the US?
It's a very rich question that you ask, Ajay, and there are so many different dimensions to it. And we look at the budget that was just released by Beijing several days ago at the National People's Congress, and we see that the military budget is increasing by over 7%, but GDP targets are down to only 5%. And what you see essentially is the Communist Party of China openly deprioritizing economic growth at the meteoric levels that China had enjoyed in prior decades, 8, 10, 15% a year. And I think much of that is the Chinese Communist Party looking to reorient economic growth so that it becomes a much more self-sufficient country that is less dependent, pardon me, on imports to countries such as the United States and Western Europe and emerging markets around the world, and one that is increasingly self-sufficient, especially in terms of technology, because that's where the Chinese government recognizes, especially now with the Biden administration's cutoff of advanced technology and especially advanced semiconductors to the Chinese economy in ways that would help the Chinese military be better able to try to achieve its ambitions in Taiwan and elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think you're seeing a significant change in Chinese strategy away from export-based growth and more towards self-sufficiency. And I think even on the U.S. side, look, we have to be frank about this, Ajay. The U.S. and China, what makes this relationship so different than the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union is that the Chinese economy is an economic powerhouse. It's the number 2 economy in the world. It may surpass that of the United States, although I think the tremendous damage that was done by Xi Jinping's sort of misguided zero COVID policies for 3 years has done enormous damage to China's economy, as well as the one-child policy. We have the real estate bubble. We have the drop in GDP per capita. We have 20% of China's college-educated youth that are unemployed. I mean, China's undergoing massive domestic economic problems, even as it looks to project power in Asia and globally. But I think from the U.S. side, we're not looking to, quote unquote, strategically decouple our economies. There are many benefits for U.S. consumers from being able to buy relatively inexpensive consumer goods from China, and these don't constitute a strategic threat to American national security. However, I think what you'll see, Ajay, is less talk about decoupling or disengagement and more about de-risking the American economy from China. So what do we mean here? First of all, again, with the technology export controls and cutoffs, to ensure that we're not fueling China's military rise in a way that endangers American security or that of our allies and partners in Asia and around the world in any troublesome manner. And so we're cutting off those technologies and those advanced semiconductors to the Chinese economy. Of course, China's response naturally is to then develop its own advanced chip sector and technology sector. And it was going to do so anyway. And especially if it's able to successfully absorb Taiwan, it's just imported the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing base in the world. It's one of the reasons that the Communist Party wants to absorb Taiwan's economy into its own. But I think also if you look at what happened with COVID and what the pandemic exposed, if you look at the malicious activities of the Chinese Communist Party in the first weeks and months of the pandemic, as the Chinese government deliberately allowed the virus to spread, right? They allowed for international flights from Wuhan all around the world, even as they closed down the internal Chinese society to Wuhan travelers. They exported the virus deliberately so that the Chinese economy would not go down under this virus, while leaving the global economy relatively unscathed or less impacted. But what did they do at the same time? They directed all of their embassies around the world to mass order masks, protective personal equipment, everything that could be required to protect the Chinese people. And then, with the Chinese people better protected in 2020, then export these goods that they bought from foreign markets either as goodwill gestures or at enormous markups to people and governments around the world desperate for protective personal equipment. So I think this is one area where we'll be looking to de-risk the American economy. Also, pharmaceuticals, being dependent on China for everyday chemicals that are required to produce pharmaceuticals to protect the health and well-being of the American people. And obviously, as I mentioned earlier, on goods that can be used for military hardware or for espionage against the United States. And I'll just note, Ajay, a very interesting report, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend, that now American industry is concerned even about relatively cheap and otherwise well-built Chinese cranes that we're using at our ports and for construction sites, but especially at ports, that may have surveillance equipment installed in them so that the Chinese government, which has passed an edict that every private Chinese company, state-owned or private, must surrender all of its data to the Chinese Communist Party upon request, can use to determine what kind of equipment or goods are coming in and out of American ports, what has military significance, so that the Chinese government knows everything that we're doing at our ports in order to better be able to strategize in the possibility of a conflict with the United States, or to conduct espionage against our infrastructure, or to simply thwart the ability of American ports to import and export goods, to move products as part of the international trading system. So on this multiplicity of fronts, we see what was a famous book written by two Chinese People's Liberation Army colonels. I think it was in 1999. The book is called Unrestricted Warfare. And we see that China is now openly engaged, the Communist Party of China, in unrestricted warfare against the United States, against India, against so many of its Asian neighbors and countries around the world, in ways that we're only now coming to sort of really richly understand and try to formulate strategic responses that are implementable, that are realistic, and that are essential for global well-being in the years and decades ahead.
Right, right. There is a lot of China everywhere, whether it's in the balloons, whether it's on the about the cranes, or even about TikTok. I wonder
Right.
how these things will pan out as the US goes to the elections very, very soon. And then when there is politics and political talk around, a lot of things can come in between. How do you see this impacting relations with other countries? Because certainly when elections are there, there is a bit of, a lot of talk around. People want to talk about so many things at the same time. And then there is this climate change, this fight between the fossil fuel and the electric fueling, everything that we do. How is it going to impact global economics as well as global politics? How do you see these things impacting not only politics, economics, but also lives for common citizens like us?
Let me try to break down your question into two parts, if I might, Ajay. And if I miss something, please come back with the follow-on questions.
Yeah.
In terms of elections, right? Anyone who's following American politics, and it's not simply engaging for American voting citizens, but also for political aficionados around the world, we've already pretty much begun the process towards electing our next American president, whether it's President Biden reelected, whether it's somebody else in the Democratic Party who bests him in the Democratic primary process, or whether it's a Republican, and whether it's the return of Donald Trump, whether it's, say, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, it's still extraordinarily early in the process. And so I don't dare touch any type of predictions in forecasting the presidential election until at the very least the end of this year, Ajay, when we have a sense of who all the candidates are going to be. And candidates can have polling numbers that work in their favor or in their disfavor. But until they're actually out on the stump, meeting voters to talk about national issues, not state issues, until they're actually out there raising funds and overseeing an extraordinarily complex campaign apparatus of thousands of employees in thousands of counties across the United States. Remember, the United States doesn't have a single presidential election. We have 51 separate presidential elections in our federal system. And so extraordinarily complex process here. Way too early to tell, but I will state this, Ajay, and I think this is one of the positive developments politically in the United States in recent years, because very candidly, we have become a significantly polarized society politically in the last 10 years or so. And a lot of that really has to do with the rise of horribly divisive social media and many Americans going into their respective silos for media and information and perspective, and really the distrust that the media have generated among the American people because they've been so poor at their jobs in the last 5, 6, 7 years, with one hoax after another foisted on the American people. But I would say this, that we now have a select committee, and I forget the exact long name of it, but it's essentially a select committee in the U.S. House of Representatives that is going to take a look at the danger posed to the global system by the Communist Party of China. And I think you'll see many more issues that are going to be the subject of congressional hearings, of events around the country, and sort of the injection of disinformation into American media, both digital media, social media, traditional media, where we learn more about the nefarious activities of the Communist Party of China to disrupt the global system that will potentially pose an even greater security threat to America and to our partners and allies worldwide. And this select committee, Ajay, is comprised of Republicans and Democrats. And in this highly polarized environment in Washington, D.C., probably the one issue that unites Republicans and Democrats more than any other is the threat from China. And so we now have a coalescence. There'll be a debate still about how we do this responsibly, how do we do this without by ensuring that we're focused on the threat from the Communist Party of China, but looking to welcome the people of China into a global trading system that should benefit them, but ideally without the nefarious rule of the Communist Party of China. I mean, that's the problem, not the Chinese people. And we need to make that distinction clear. And that needs to be careful in all of our communications and all of our activities and the like. But I think that's going to be very influential in shaping the debate on national security, and to your previous question about the role of economics here and the American economy either decoupling or, as I would underline, de-risking its relationship with China. These are all going to shape the debate about who is going to be the next president of the United States and what does that mean for our budget priorities, both in terms of probably increasing our defense budget to maybe as much as $1 trillion a year by 2026, 2027. How do we do this in the United States, Ajay, while our debt service, now that interest rates have gone up from 0.25% to 3, 4, 5%, and the United States federal government is paying $800 billion to $1 trillion in debt service only by 2030 or 2032. So we're going to have to sort out these fiscal responsibilities and capabilities in the American presidential process as well. So that sort of oversimplifies how this will play out politically, but I think this will be one of the unifying issues in American politics. Regarding the climate issue that you raise, I have to concede here, Ajay, that I don't really see national leaders on the world stage taking the climate issue very seriously. I will say the one exception has been in most of Europe, and now under the Biden administration here in Washington, D.C., because it's a Democratic Party priority. But my own sense is that, first of all, without fossil fuels, we probably cannot effectively feed 4 to 5 billion people around the world. Just in terms of fertilizers that come from the extraction of natural gas, the ability to lubricate the major machinery that moves farmland production, that moves the harvest to ports. You truck, you fly, you ship goods around the world. So much of the global food and agricultural process infrastructure is utterly dependent on oil and natural gas. You can't feed the world on solar power and wind energy. It's not going to happen. So we just need to be honest about this. And we also can't build the essential infrastructure that emerging economies need, using steel and cement and ammonia and plastics to be able to move from an underdeveloped state to that of an advanced industrial state, which I would state the emerging countries around the world have every right to aspire to. So why would we in the G7 deny fossil fuels to the developing world in order to be able to achieve a lifestyle and a quality of life that we enjoy in the G7 and several other countries in Asia? So when I see national leaders making decisions that look like they take quote unquote climate change seriously, I'll believe it. Climate is always changing. That's the definition of climate. It's inherent there. Now, will we have shocks to the biosphere in the future because of fossil fuel use, because of natural phenomena? Yes. And to date, we've essentially been able to deal with this using technology, adaptive technologies. And I'm a great believer in humankind's ability to develop adaptive technologies to deal with the potential shocks to the international system from climate. And will we gradually move towards more dependence on renewable energy? Yes, of course we will. The technology is moving us there. But the laws of physics and the laws of economics don't care about these artificial target years that end in 0 and 5, Ajay. So we can talk about 2035 and 2050. Physics and economics don't care. These are human inventions, they're political inventions, and they mostly come from politicians who don't know anything about these issues or how essential fossil fuels are to the tremendous prosperity that we enjoy as human beings today more than at any other time in the world. I mean, if we're frank about this, there's never been a better time to live materially on planet Earth than today, March 7th or 8th, 2023. And so I think, yes, we will gradually move towards renewable energy, but let's develop the technology so that we have electric battery storage that is capable of being able to store the electricity that's going to be needed with growing demand around the world. When the quote unquote global south increasingly connects to the internet and using smartphone technology and becomes a much more electricity dependent economy or multiplicity of economies around the world, where is all of this additional electricity going to come from? Much of it may come from renewable energy, but most of it will come from oil, natural gas, coal, and ideally nuclear energy, which is the most energy dense form available and is zero carbon. So anyone who's serious about climate change and excludes nuclear power, in my estimation, is not serious about climate policy.
Right, John. Right. And while you were speaking, I was just thinking how difficult your job is at Trilogy Advisors. Why? I'll tell you. Because you are so clued into the political happenings, to the politicians also who don't know about several things, and also to the business people. How do you actually manage to bring about your geopolitical risk reports and share with your clients with so much things, in the you when you know so many things at the same time, and it can be so much difficult, to actually put them out for the clients. How do you manage to do that so that they actually are able to make sense of the so many changes that are happening politically and economically at the same time?
Well, first of all, Ajay, thank you for the kind comments. It can be a daily struggle sometimes trying to stay on top of the vast, sort of immense amounts of information that come our way. And you know that as well as I do. I'm very privileged, fortunate being based here in Washington, D.C. I'm able to engage in conversations with officials in the executive branch, lawmakers, senators, members of Congress, congressional staff, the intelligence community, the military sector here in Washington, D.C., and of course, media and the panoply of think tanks, literally hundreds of think tanks and foreign policy institutes, where our ongoing conversations help us apply, hopefully, some measure of wisdom to this cascade of information and data that comes our way every day. And so that's how we deal with this on a governmental and political level, recognizing, Ajay, the reality that, especially for politicians, their number one objective day to day is to ensure that they are reelected in the next election cycle, and making sure that the decisions that they make and the information that they are integrating into their work helps them achieve that goal. And I don't want to sound cynical there, but it's the nature of human beings, right? Those who choose to run for political office in democracies like India and the United States need to be reelected so that they have the legitimacy of the will of the people behind their decisions and their actions. So that's sort of a simplified way of explaining how we deal with this work on a political and governmental level. In terms of business, I'm very fortunate. We have a thriving client portfolio here at Trilogy Advisors. where we are advising clients either with client-specific products and services, webcasts, reports, board calls, and also now that the lockdowns of COVID are behind us, being able to meet with CEOs and C-suite executives and large audiences at events around the United States and elsewhere in the world to talk about these issues on stage, being able to address audiences directly, to engage their questions directly, and to be able to impart knowledge and information and wisdom to the degree possible so that they're able to incorporate this geopolitical information into their corporate planning and investment management strategies.
Right, right, John. So how can people, company, they can connect with your company, with you, so that they can know more about the work you do, about the things you think about, write about, what your company does, so that they can, professionally as well as in general day to day, they can make use of all the information that you people provide.
Thank you for that opportunity, Ajay. I'm on LinkedIn. And so if people remember to spell my name correctly, it can be tricky sometimes. But John Sitilides on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Facebook. And you can also go to my company website, trilogyadvisors.net, and connect with me there. And I'm happy to respond to all inquiries and look to see where we provide deeper engagement on these critical geopolitical issues for your audience members and beyond, Ajay.
Right, right, John. My last question to
Yes,
you
sir.
is, okay, sir, let me put it this way. Generally, I prepare only a one-sheeter, and it contains bit of information about the guest, my initial line, so that I don't forget, even if I do. Sometimes you can even forget your own name, forget about the guest name, and a few questions, and then most of it is unscripted. But today, I prepared 2 pages. One page is this all about the achievements, about the things that you have done in your life, and it's a whole page. And this page is not some resume that has been embellished. These are all your achievements. I will certainly put it in the YouTube description. But what I want to say, John, is that you have achieved so much in life. You can sit pretty at any place. You have your wife is an attorney, you have 4 sons, and it can be a beautiful life. But still, you are working hard. You travel all across the globe, you meet people all the time, you are busy, and you are trying to make a difference. One thing I can certainly tell you, it's not about more money now. What is it that you seek for yourself and for anything that you seek? What is it that you want to achieve now?
Hmm. Thank you for that question, Ajay. I wasn't sure that I'd be receiving what I would probably call a spiritual question, but I welcome it. My parents, who were economic refugees from Greece in the early 1950s after Nazi Germany and then the communists destroyed northern Greece, they came to the United States seeking greater opportunity and greater freedom so that they could raise children who they thought could leave the world a better place than the one that they were born into. And I derived that philosophy also from learning about my grandparents, who were political refugees from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s to the Republic of Greece in the early 1920s, again, that same period. And so I've tried to learn from the traditions that have been passed down to me that I'm very fortunate to have received from a very devoted family. And as you correctly note, I'm blessed with an amazing wife and 4 spectacular, magnificent sons. And I hope to bequeath to them, Ajay, a better America and a better world than the one that I was born into. And whatever tiny, modest contribution I can make to American statecraft, to American diplomacy, and to helping advise leaders, American and worldwide, how to make better decisions to benefit their citizens and their countries. And maybe the one point I will concede to you about mankind is here to make the world a better place. And it's sometimes a cliched or corny phrase, but I think that's really what the great purpose of our being here should ultimately be. And how do we just leave this world better than we found it? And so I'm hoping to be able to do that here in Washington, D.C., for my family, for my friends, for my loved ones, for my colleagues, and for audiences that I'm fortunate to meet in person at live events around the country and around the world, and through digital technology with people like you, Ajay, and your distinguished audience around the world. I think it's our obligation to ourselves, to those who are closest to us, and to men and women distant around the world to leave this a better place than we found it.
Wonderful. On this note, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Ajay.